And the Iranian armed forces held a massive naval parade in the Sea of Oman in the presence of President Hassan Rouhani and top military commanders. The parade was held near the southern port city of Josk. More than 100 Navy vessels took part in the parade. It included domestically built warships, submarines, and missile-equipped speedboats. The massive show of naval might wrapped up 7 days of major military exercises by the 4 divisions of the Iranian armed forces. The latest weapons developed by the armed forces were field tested during the drills. The maneuvers covered 2.2 million square kilometers on land and at sea from southern Iran to the southern parts of the Gulf of Aden.
Russia has agreed to sell 8 nuclear reactors to the Middle Eastern country for peaceful use. For now, the Russians will help the Iranians build 2 nuclear power plants, while the rest of the reactors will reportedly be built at a later date.
NATO warplanes around the Baltics had to scramble more than 100 times this year in response to a, quote, substantial increase in Russian air activity, which is posing a risk to civilian air traffic, according to the alliance's chief.
What I can say is that there has been a substantial increase in Russian military air activity along NATO borders. We have had more than 100 intercepts by NATO aircraft in the Baltic Sea this year, and that's more than 3 times as much as the total number of intercepts of Russian aircrafts in the whole of last year.
During a visit to Estonia this month, the NATO chief said that a 50% increase in Russia's air activity over the past year is a stark reminder of Cold War times. The European Leadership Network, a London-based non-profit organization, reported of at least 40 high-risk incidents and airspace violations by Russian military aircrafts since the Kremlin annexed Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula in March. In October, Sweden, which is not a NATO member, began one of its biggest military operations since the Cold War after a submarine was sighted in the archipelago outside Stockholm. Responding to widespread media speculation, Russia's defense ministry consistently denied that one of its vessels was in Swedish waters. NATO members have sought to fill in gaps in the alliance's land, air and sea defenses since Russia's annexation of Crimea and involvement in the conflict in East Ukraine.
There is a strong belief that Russia's action is violating international law. I know President Putin seems to have a different set of lawyers making a different set of interpretations, but I don't think that's fooling anybody.
President Obama continuing to put pressure on Russian President Vladimir Putin over his country's occupation of Ukraine.
Again, with new signs, the region at the heart of Ukraine's crisis is ready to join Russia.
Well, things could get worse between the U.S. and Russia, but someone would probably have to start shooting. We're now getting word that Moscow may soon be helping Iran develop its nuclear program. The Kremlin discussing plans to send teams of atomic experts to Tehran and inviting Iranian scientists to Russia for training. This as Russia slams the U.S. for supporting its rival Georgia. Peter Brooks is a former Pentagon official. Thank you for being with us. Well, Russia is in the process of selling an anti-aircraft system to Iran, and the New York Sun says this has potential to make any future bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities a riskier proposition for both Israel and America. As we've said, Russia already helping Iran with nukes. How serious is this?
Well, it's very serious. I mean, one of the ways that Russia might try to strike back at us over Georgia is by increasing its cooperation with Iran. Patty Ann, as you know, they're already building Iran's first nuclear reactor, which will support Iran's nuclear weapons aspirations. They've also provided fuel for this reactor. The reactor may be up and running by the end of this year. They're providing them weapons. They're also providing weapons to Syria. They may also help Iran with its ballistic missile program, which is of concern to us because Iran right now is involved in a intercontinental ballistic missile program, which would allow them, if they develop nuclear weapons, to put one of those weapons on top of a missile and reach out and touch the United States.
Boy, you know, Russia and Iran haven't always been friends, so isn't it risky for Russia to provide this rogue nation with nukes?
Patty Ann, that's a very good point, because they do have a tortured history. They've not always agreed on things. They're rivals in the same area. They've both been powers in that part of the world. And the fact of the matter is, it's really risky behavior on the part of the Russians for their own national security if they start to support Iran's power projection capabilities, such as nuclear weapons or long-range missiles. Because at some point, Iran might decide that Russia's not somebody they really want to deal with, and this will come to threaten Russia itself.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the Russian Navy deploying ships to the Caribbean for joint naval exercises with Venezuela, and Venezuela's President Hugo Chavez says, go ahead and squeal, Yankees. Is this a provocation to the U.S.?
Absolutely, and they may improve their relations with Cuba again as well. Russia's going to reach out and try to touch all of our buttons over this issue of Georgia, about NATO expansion, Kosovo, a whole host of things. They're going to sell arms to Syria. They're going to get involved with Iran. They may become closer to China. They may reach out into our own hemisphere with Venezuela and Cuba. I mean, there's a whole host of things that Russia's going to try to make it more painful for us in their relations with them. If they put bases in Venezuela, if they put bases in Cuba, I mean, that would certainly raise tensions a lot. Of course, the Monroe Doctrine goes back to the 19th century, but yes, we've always believed that this part of the hemisphere was something that we had very strong interests in, and if others were to try to interfere in this part, we would take that with grave concern. So,
turning our attentions now to rising tensions in Eastern Europe after new reports that Russia is deploying missiles to a small piece of territory on the Baltic Sea called Kaliningrad. That area borders two NATO countries, Poland and Lithuania. The missile reportedly being moved there is called the Iskander. The 23-foot short-range missile can be moved around and launched on a truck. It's designed to destroy both stationary and moving targets. The Iskander missile also war-ready for use in theater-level combat situations. There are two variants with a range of up to 250 miles. All this as tensions continue between the West and Russia over the trouble in Ukraine. This, another salvo in Russia's increasing aggression toward the West. Poland and Lithuania are said to be nervous over the discovery of these Russian missiles right on their doorstep. Should they be?
Oh, they absolutely should be. And I think you framed it exactly right. This is very much part of a larger conversation, in fact, a larger contest that's taking place between the Russian Federation on the one side and the West on the other side. Ukraine is really the bellwether for everything that's happening. The historical background for everything that you're seeing in Ukraine is the fact that Ukraine was on track until late November to sign an association agreement with the European Union, which is a very important symbolic step that would align Ukraine's economy with that of the EU and not with Russia. Russia is pushing back. They're trying to bring Ukraine back into their economic and also their ideological orbit. And what they're doing through this deployment, which by all accounts happened several months ago but is only becoming public now, is warning the West to stay back and not interfere in the post-Soviet space.
Right. Remembering the Cuban Missile Crisis, those were huge intercontinental ballistic missiles. They had to be moved in on ships. These are very small mobile missiles that can be trucked around the country. Essentially, the Russians were able to sneak them into this particular area. Because it happened several months ago, do you think it was related to the Ukraine situation? Was it sort of a warning?
Well, I think the pressure on Kaliningrad, which is a Baltic enclave, which the Russians, which is territorially Russian, but it's landlocked, has been an area of some dispute for some time. But it was seen as sort of the new order in Europe. The Russians are acting accordingly. And what you're seeing now, particularly when you see building blocks in Russia's sort of effort to reconstitute an empire, like Ukraine, being up for grabs, the Russians are trying to move as many pieces on the chessboard as they can, and they're trying to demonstrate to the West that they will not go quietly.
But with countries like Poland, which used to be a Soviet state, now joining in NATO, if the Russians were to launch those missiles, that becomes an attack on a NATO nation and brings on huge retaliation by other NATO members, right?
No, absolutely. And the Russians, I think, are very cognizant of the fact that NATO, at least until the last several years, has been steadily expanding eastward into the area that Russia sees as its own geopolitical backyard. The Russians have been trying very concertedly over the last several years to do things like, for example, military intervention in Georgia that suggests to NATO that perhaps this isn't a good idea. The Kaliningrad deployment is part of that process.
Ilan Berman keeping an eye on that situation, as will we. Ilan, thanks for sharing your expertise.
My pleasure.
Russia has reportedly deployed Iskander missiles in the country's westernmost region of Kaliningrad, raising concerns among neighboring NATO countries. Russia has long warned about its deployment of the Iskander, a truck-based theater ballistic missile system, in response to NATO's European missile shield. Reports say that the system may have already been deployed in Kaliningrad, which borders NATO members Poland and Lithuania. The Iskander has a maximum range of 400 kilometers, making Berlin its furthest western target when launched from Kaliningrad. The interim capability of the NATO missile shield includes a high-powered X-band radar based in Turkey and one Aegis-equipped US warship deployed in the Mediterranean. In the future, the program will expand with more anti-missile warships and 2 land-based missile defense sites, one to be operational in Romania in 2015 and the other in Poland in 2018. The Iskander warheads descend at supersonic speeds, meaning they could penetrate the ground-based radar and interceptors of the NATO shield. Russian media reported that the missiles have already been stationed in the area for more than a year.
A Russian general has received a rather unusual souvenir from Tehran, an Iranian-made copy of a US spy drone, the one Tehran says it shot down last year. Tehran claims to have reverse-engineered the device and decoded all the data it had stored, and lately has even unveiled its own new drone designs. Let's talk about this live with Fuad Izadi, Professor of Political Communication at the University of Tehran. Mr. Izadi, welcome to RT. Thank you for joining us here. Of all nations, why has this drone been given to Russia then?
Well, I think in the last many years, Iran's relations with Russia has improved. They have found common ground in areas like the Syrian conflict. I think Russia under President Putin has adopted a more independent foreign policy. The new Russia is not going to be pushed around by the United States or any other Western power. And I think that fits with Iran's foreign policy. And I think because of common history, common border, and common interests in international relations, I think Iran is trying to improve its relations with Russia. And I think that's just a sign of good gesture from the Iranian side.
Мелкими группами одиночными самолетами во всем диапазоне высоких скоростей. Применяют постановку помех, как из зон баражирования, так и из состава ударных групп. Применяют маневр против управления стрельбой. Ставлю задачу выдачу целеуказаний считать постановку боевой задачи. Цель обнаружения самостоятельных задач по моей команде. Как приняли задачу первую. Как приняли задачу вторую.
You